All right, so today we're going to be diving into um, the world of conservative thought.
Okay.
We've got this book here called 100 Questions and 100 Conservative Answers.
Mm-hmm.
It's written by Adérito Tiago Vieira,
Okay.
and we're going to try to kind of unpack some key conservative viewpoints and see how they connect with, the world we live in today.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting about this book is that it's not just sort of like a surface level look at,
Right.
conservative talking points.
Right.
It's really trying to like articulate a whole worldview.
Yeah, it gets into the why behind the what.
Exactly.
So, before we jump into any specifics, maybe we should start with like just the basics.
Sure.
How does this book define conservatism?
Well, they tie conservatism to a few key ideas.
Okay.
A strong respect for tradition,
Okay.
the importance of order,
Mhm.
an emphasis on individual responsibility,
Okay.
and a healthy skepticism of unchecked government power.
Okay.
And they use this interesting analogy of a carefully cultivated garden.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one before.
Yeah.
It kind of implies like the sense of nurturing something valuable over time
Mhm.
and like a cautious approach to change.
Exactly. And that's, it's like a core part of the conservative worldview is this understanding that, things have value because they've proven themselves over time.
Right?
And it's not about rejecting all change. It's about approaching change cautiously and with a respect for what came before.
Okay.
Now, the book doesn't treat conservatism as like one big monolithic entity.
Right.
It mentions figures like Edmund Burke,
Of course.
F.A. Hayek, and Russell Kirk.
Yeah, thinkers from different times and backgrounds, but all kind of under this broad umbrella of conservatism.
Exactly. And each brings their own unique perspective to the table.
Right.
So, for example, Burke was really concerned about the dangers of radical revolutions.
Mm.
If you think about the French Revolution,
Okay.
he wasn't just opposed to the violence and the bloodshed. He was really worried about this attempt to completely remake society based on abstract ideals, which he saw as a recipe for disaster.
So for Burke, tradition wasn't just like nostalgia, it was like a safeguard against recklessness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He saw those long-standing customs and institutions as embodying a kind of hard-won wisdom, something that couldn't be easily replaced by some theoretical model.
Right.
Then you have Hayek, who's writing in a very different era,
Right.
and he was preoccupied with the threats to individual freedom posed by expanding government power.
And that's kind of most famously articulated in The Road to Serfdom,
Yes.
where he argues that even well-intentioned government interventions can pave the way for tyranny.
Exactly. And, a key example he used was the control of prices.
Mm-hmm.
Hayek argued that when the government tries to fix prices, it disrupts the natural flow of information in the market.
Okay.
This leads to shortages, surpluses, and ultimately a less efficient and less free economy.
So for Hayek, economic freedom was a cornerstone of individual liberty, and interfering with the market was a step towards like controlling people's lives.
Exactly. And then you have Kirk, who was really a champion of the Western tradition.
Mm-hmm.
He saw Western civilization as this repository of valuable knowledge and insights
Right.
that had been tested and refined over centuries.
Okay.
He argued that these traditions deserved respect and careful consideration before being discarded or radically altered.
So they might differ on the specifics, but I'm hearing this common thread.
Yeah.
This respect for tradition,
Yeah.
for ordered liberty,
Mhm.
and for the idea that like lasting change happens gradually.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to, one of the really core aspects of conservative thought,
Okay.
the value of tradition.
Okay.
The book emphasizes that cultural heritage isn't just some relic of the past.
Right.
It's the glue that holds a society together.
Yeah, going back to that garden analogy.
Yeah.
A garden needs those established plants to provide structure and beauty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And traditions provide that kind of framework for society.
Okay.
A sense of shared identity, a
Yeah.
sense of belonging, an understanding of your place in the grand scheme of things.
But doesn't that create a resistance to progress? What about the need to adapt to a changing world?
That's where the idea of prescription comes in.
Okay.
It's a concept that Russell Kirk really elaborated on, building on Burke's work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the idea that those long-standing customs and institutions,
Okay.
those traditions, are more reliable than untested theories.
Okay.
They've stood the test of time.
So it's not about blindly clinging to the past,
No.
but recognizing that there's wisdom embedded in those traditions.
Exactly. And that wisdom can help us navigate the complexities of the modern world.
Okay.
To give you a concrete example, think about the common law tradition. It developed over centuries in England,
Right.
relying on precedent and the accumulated wisdom of judges grappling with real-life cases.
So it's a legal system based on experience rather than just abstract principles.
Precisely. And for conservatives, that practical lived experience is invaluable. It's a safeguard against the hubris of thinking we can design a perfect system from scratch.
Right.
Now let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about the book's stance on government funding for the arts.
Right.
To put it bluntly, they're not big fans.
They argue that when the state becomes the patron of the arts, it inevitably leads to politicization.
Right. They worry that you end up with art that serves the agenda of those in power
Right.
rather than genuine artistic expression.
Mm-hmm.
And this ties back to Hayek's concerns about the dangers of government control.
Right.
He argued that anytime the government takes control of a sector of society, it distorts the natural mechanisms of that sector
Okay.
and makes it less efficient and less responsive to people's actual needs.
So applying that to the arts, government funding could stifle creativity and
Mhm.
lead to art that's more about ideology than like genuine expression.
Exactly. The book cites Roger Scruton,
Okay.
a conservative philosopher
Okay.
who believed that true culture springs from local communities,
Mm-hmm.
not from government directives. He argued that art should be rooted in the lived experiences of people,
Mm-hmm.
in their traditions and their shared understandings,
Mm.
not imposed from above.
It's like trying to force a plant to grow a certain way
Yeah.
instead of letting it flourish organically.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And, this concern about disrupting natural cultural development
Right.
goes all the way back to Burke and his critique of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
He was horrified by the revolutionaries' attempt to replace traditional religious holidays with these secular celebrations.
Okay.
He saw this as this destructive attack on the organic cultural fabric of France,
Right.
an attempt to sever people's connection to their past.
So the book argues for a more hands-off approach,
Mm.
letting art evolve organically within communities
Yes.
without government interference.
Precisely. Now let's move on to something that's closely related.
Okay.
The book's really passionate defense of local culture.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting
Okay.
because it ties in so closely with that idea of identity and belonging.
Yeah, it seems like local culture is seen as this kind of anchor in a world that's becoming increasingly globalized.
Exactly. It gives us a sense of place,
Right.
a sense of rootedness.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand why this matters so much to conservatives, we need to revisit Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France.
Okay, so what was Burke getting at in that work?
Well, Burke saw local cultures as these repositories of inherited wisdom,
Okay.
something that couldn't be replicated by abstract ideals.
Okay.
Remember, he was writing in response to the French Revolution,
Mhm.
which tried to impose this universal vision of man
Right.
and a rationalized social order.
Right.
And Burke argued that this completely ignored the organic-rooted traditions of different communities and the practical wisdom that was embedded in those traditions.
It's like trying to plant the same type of flower everywhere,
Yeah,
regardless of like the soil or the climate.
exactly. Burke believed that different cultures flourish in different ways,
Right.
and that attempting to force uniformity leads to this loss of richness and diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the book builds on this idea by highlighting the importance of what they call mediating institutions.
Mediating institutions, what are those?
So think about those institutions that stand between the individual and the state.
Okay.
Things like families, churches, local clubs, volunteer organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They act as these kind of buffers against the concentration of power in the hands of the state.
Okay.
And they provide spaces where individuals can come together, form bonds, and develop a sense of shared identity.
So they're kind of like the connective tissue of society.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And conservatives believe that a strong and vibrant civil society
Okay.
filled with these mediating institutions is crucial for a healthy and free society.
Right.
The book argues that these institutions are often rooted in local culture,
Mm-hmm.
embodying the values and traditions of a particular community.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect.
Yeah.
This importance of tradition. The skepticism of unchecked government power.
Yeah.
And now this emphasis on local culture and these mediating institutions.
Right.
It all seems to point towards like a certain vision of how society should be structured.
You're absolutely right. And it's a vision that's deeply rooted in a belief in the limitations of human reason
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of inherited wisdom.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we don't always have all the answers
Right.
and that the best solutions to social problems often emerge organically from within communities,
Right.
not from top-down government directives.
Right.
Now, think about your own community for a second.
Okay.
What are some aspects of local culture that are important to you? What gives you that sense of belonging,
Yeah.
of rootedness in a particular place?
That's a great question. It really makes you realize how these abstract ideas that we're talking about actually shape our everyday experiences.
They do.
And speaking of shaping experiences,
Okay.
let's tackle the book's stance on Western culture. They explicitly state that Western culture should be valued, citing its contributions to governance, individual rights, and human flourishing as evidence of its worth.
Yeah, they even quote Edmund Burke, who referred to Western traditions as a general bank of wisdom accumulated over centuries.
It's like that cultivated garden again, but on a much grander scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Conservatives see Western culture as this incredibly valuable inheritance,
Yeah.
something that shaped the world for the better.
But of course, no discussion of Western culture would be complete without acknowledging its complexities. And, there are criticisms.
Sure.
And I think it's crucial to have those conversations in a balanced and nuanced way.
Yeah, you're right. It's about recognizing both the good and the bad,
Right.
while still believing that the good outweighs the bad.
Right. And the book does acknowledge those complexities.
Yeah.
It doesn't shy away from the criticisms.
Yeah.
But it ultimately concludes that Western culture is something worth defending.
Precisely. They believe that despite its flaws, Western civilization has made significant contributions to human progress.
Right.
And that its core principles are worth preserving.
Okay, now let's move on to the sometimes contentious world of media and government.
Right.
The book takes a pretty clear stance.
Okay.
The government's role in the media should be extremely limited.
And that limit, they argue, should basically boil down to simply enforcing laws against things like libel, slander, and incitement to violence.
Okay.
Anything beyond that, they warn, is a slippery slope toward controlling information and suppressing dissent.
Yeah, I can see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
They connect this to the importance of like a robust public sphere where ideas can be freely debated without government interference.
Exactly. And once again, Hayek's road to serfdom is invoked as a warning.
Okay.
This time, it's a warning against the dangers of centralized control of information. Hayek argued that allowing the government to control the flow of information gives it this immense power to manipulate public opinion and suppress dissenting viewpoints.
He saw this as a crucial step toward totalitarianism.
So they're arguing that a free media, even one that's sometimes messy and biased, is far less dangerous than a media controlled by the state.
Precisely. They believe that the free exchange of ideas, even if those ideas are sometimes flawed or offensive, is ultimately the best way to arrive at truth and hold power accountable.
They also bring up Alexis de Tocqueville, who was incredibly impressed by the free press in America during his travels in the 1830s. He saw it as a vital check on power.
Yeah. Tocqueville contrasted that with the potential for government-controlled media to stifle dissent and create this echo chamber of propaganda. He believed that a free press was essential for keeping the government honest and for informing the public so they could make informed decisions.
And how does this tie back to those mediating institutions that we discussed earlier?
Well, the book argues that a free media acts as a vital mediating institution, standing between the individual and the state.
It provides a platform for diverse voices and perspectives, ensuring that the government can't control the flow of information and shape the narrative to suit its own agenda.
So for them, a free and independent media is crucial for a healthy and functioning democracy.
Absolutely.
Now let's dive into one of the most hotly debated topics out there. The welfare state. The book takes a cautious approach, advocating for limited social assistance, focused on the truly vulnerable, while warning against excessive welfare programs. They express concern that these programs can create a culture of dependency, discourage work, and undermine individual responsibility. And they bring Hayek back into the conversation to illustrate their point. They use Hayek's critique of central planning to explain what they call the knowledge problem, which is this idea that the information needed to make effective decisions is dispersed throughout society, not concentrated in the hands of government planners. So when the government tries to manage something as complex as the economy, especially through something like a large welfare program, it's essentially operating with incomplete information.
And that can lead to those unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Like perverse incentives.
Right.
Where people are actually better off staying on welfare than trying to find work.
Exactly. The book also cites Russell Kirk,
Yes.
who emphasized the importance of societal bonds and a sense of duty.
Right.
He worried that excessive reliance on the state could weaken those bonds, leading to a decline in individual responsibility and a sense of community. So they're not saying we shouldn't help people in need, but that we should be mindful of the potential for government programs to create these unintended consequences and to erode those values of self-reliance and community.
Exactly. And this connects back to Tocqueville's observations about the importance of local communities and voluntary associations in American democracy. He argued that these institutions, not the state, were the primary sources of social cohesion and mutual support.
That makes sense. It's about finding that balance between compassion and individual responsibility.
Right.
And ensuring that efforts to help those in need don't unintentionally create more problems than they solve.
You got it. And that brings us to another key distinction in conservative thought.
Okay.
One that often comes up in debates about social and economic policy.
Right.
The difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Okay.
The book draws a very sharp line between these two concepts.
Right. They argue that while ensuring equal opportunity is a worthy goal, pursuing equal outcomes is not only impossible, and also dangerous.
Exactly. And to understand why they turned to Hayek's analysis in the Constitution of Liberty.
Okay.
He argued that attempting to equalize outcomes inevitably leads to restrictions on freedom.
Okay.
Because to achieve equal outcomes, the government must intervene in people's lives, dictating choices and redistributing resources.
So you end up with a situation where the government is picking winners and losers to ensure that everyone ends up with the same prize at the end of the race, regardless of their individual efforts or talents.
Exactly. The book also brings in Russell Kirk, who critiqued egalitarianism, arguing that it ignores the natural diversity of human talents. He believed that different people are suited for different roles in society.
Right.
And that trying to force everyone into the same mold is both foolish and harmful.
He saw value in the natural hierarchy that emerges when individuals are free to pursue their own paths, rather than being constrained by the government's attempt to enforce equality.
Precisely, he believed that a society that embraces the diversity of human talents and allows individuals to find their own place within the social order would be a more vibrant and fulfilling one.
And to illustrate the potential dangers of this pursuit of equality of outcome, they turn to Alexis de Tocqueville again. Right. Yes, he warned of a soft tyranny emerging in democratic societies.
Yeah, Tocqueville worried that in the name of equality, the state could gradually expand its power, taking over more and more aspects of people's lives, and ultimately creating a society where individuals are dependent on the government and lacking in self-reliance and initiative.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It is.
That the pursuit of something as seemingly noble as equality could actually lead to a loss of freedom.
It's a reminder that even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
Right.
And that we need to be very careful about the kind of power we grant to the state.
Now let's move on to the crucial topic of education.
Right.
The book argues that education should be about more than just job training. It should also transmit those traditional values that we've been discussing.
Values like respect for family religion, personal responsibility, and cultural heritage. They see education as a form of cultural inheritance, a way of passing on the accumulated wisdom of the past to future generations.
They quote Edmund Burke again, who talked about society as a partnership between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it.
It is. And education, in this view, is about connecting those generations, ensuring that the knowledge and values of the past aren't lost.
The book also brings up Richard Weaver, who, in his book, Ideas Have Consequences, argued that the erosion of objective moral truth could lead to the disintegration of society. He was deeply concerned about the rise of relativism and the idea that there are no absolute moral standards.
Weaver believed that without a shared moral framework, society would descend into chaos. And education, in the conservative view, plays a key role in preventing that by instilling those traditional values in young people.
But they're also wary of too much government involvement in education, right? It's that road to serfdom argument again, applied to the world of education.
They argue that a diverse ecosystem of educational approaches is better with families and private institutions playing a prominent role. This allows for a greater diversity of thought and prevents the state from using education as a tool for social engineering.
So they're advocating for a more decentralized approach to education, one that gives more power to parents and local communities.
Precisely. They believe that a one-size-fits-all approach to education dictated by the government would stifle creativity, limit choice, and potentially indoctrinate students with a particular ideology.
Now let's talk about a topic that's been making headlines, immigration.
Right.
The book argues that globalization poses a challenge to national identity. They suggest that this relentless push toward homogenization, driven by economic forces and the spread of globalized culture, can erode the unique character of nations.
And here again, we see that concept of prescription come into play. Conservatives value the unique cultural heritage of different nations. And they see globalization as a potential threat to that heritage.
It's like trying to create a single bland garden out of all the diverse and beautiful gardens in the world.
That's a great way to put it. Conservatives believe that each nation has its own story to tell, its own traditions and values that have shaped its identity, and that those things are worth preserving even in the face of globalization.
They also bring up Roger Scruton's idea of orcophilia, this love of home. They argue that this love of home is deeply connected to national identity, to that sense of belonging to a particular place and people.
Exactly.
And they worry that globalization, with its emphasis on mobility and cosmopolitanism, can weaken those local attachments. They believe that a strong sense of national identity is essential for social cohesion and for a sense of shared purpose.
Yes. And finally, the book uses Michael Oakeshott's distinction between technical and practical knowledge to explain why globalization can be problematic.
So what's the distinction there?
Well, Oakeshott argued that technical knowledge is abstract and universal, while practical knowledge is rooted in the specific experiences of a particular community. And they argue that globalization, with its emphasis on universal principles and global solutions, can undermine that practical knowledge that's been accumulated over generations within specific cultures.
Yeah, it's like trying to apply a single set of gardening rules to every garden in the world.
Exactly.
Regardless of the climate or the soil.
They believe that different cultures have developed their own unique ways of doing things, and that those ways of doing things embody a kind of wisdom that shouldn't be dismissed.
I mean, let's get a little more specific. The book argues that immigration should be based on merit, suggesting a system that prioritizes skills and attributes that would benefit the receiving country.
This aligns with that conservative emphasis on individual responsibility and the belief that people should be rewarded for their hard work and talent. They argue that an immigration system that focuses on merit would benefit both the immigrants themselves and the receiving country.
But they also acknowledge that a purely meritocratic approach can be too narrow, right?
Yeah. They argue that other factors like cultural compatibility and the ability to integrate into society should also be considered.
So it's about finding a balance between welcoming newcomers and preserving the character of the nation.
Exactly. And that balance is something that each nation must determine for itself, taking into account its own unique circumstances and needs.
But one thing they are crystal clear on is the importance of border security.
Yes.
They argue that a nation has the right to control its borders and to determine who enters its territory.
They connect this to the idea of national sovereignty, the right of a nation to govern itself free from external interference.
So they're arguing that a nation without secure borders is like a house without walls, vulnerable to all sorts of threats, from economic disruption and cultural erosion to crime and violence.
And they believe that open borders, without careful consideration of the impact on the nation's identity and security, can undermine the very foundations of a nation state.
It's a complex issue.
It is.
But the book makes it clear that conservatives see border security as fundamental to national sovereignty and self-preservation.
Now let's shift gears again and talk about freedom.
Oh, are we talking about censorship?
Exactly.
You know, conservatives and their deep love for free speech.
Right. They see censorship as this major red flag. a sign that someone's trying to control the narrative and shut down dissenting voices.
They quote Roger Spurgeon, who said that freedom of thought and expression is the very foundation of a free society.
And of course, Hayek makes another appearance.
Right.
This time he argues that freedom of speech is essential for nearly every other form of freedom. If you can't speak freely, if you can't express your ideas and challenge the status quo, then other freedoms become meaningless.
So they see censorship as like a direct attack on the heart of a free society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're not just talking about censorship by the government.
Right.
They're also concerned about censorship by corporations, by social media platforms, by anyone who has the power to silence dissenting voices.
So it's about protecting that free and open exchange of ideas, even when those ideas are unpopular or offensive.
Now, here's a question that often comes up in debates about free speech.
Okay.
Should freedom of expression include the right to criticize the government?
I think we can guess what a conservative would say to that.
You're right. They would say absolutely.
Yeah.
They see the freedom to criticize the government as a cornerstone of a healthy democracy.
Okay.
They believe that those in power need to be held accountable.
Right.
And that allowing citizens to speak freely and criticize their actions is the best way to do that.
They bring back Edmund Burke,
who famously said, "The greater the power, the more dangerous the abuse." It's a reminder that power corrupts.
It does.
And those in power need to be kept in check.
And what better way to keep them in check than through open and robust criticism from the people they govern?
Okay, now for a trickier question. Should freedom of expression include offensive speech? This is where conservatives are often portrayed as being like in favor of censorship.
But that's a misrepresentation.
Okay.
Conservatives believe that freedom of speech is this fundamental principle that must be upheld, even when it involves offensive or unpopular viewpoints.
Okay.
They argue that the best way to counter bad ideas is not through censorship, but through open debate and the presentation of better ideas.
So it's about trusting the marketplace of ideas to sort things out.
Exactly. They believe that suppressing ideas, even offensive ones, ultimately does more harm than good.
Now, what about the protection of unpopular opinions?
That seems like a core concern for conservatives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They see the protection of unpopular opinions as essential for individual liberty.
Okay.
And the preservation of a free society. They believe that the ability to express dissenting or controversial views is vital for maintaining intellectual diversity and preventing the tyranny of the majority.
They quote Russell Kirk, who said that one of the core responsibilities of a conservative is to uphold protections for the conservative dissenter. So it's about ensuring that even those who hold views that are out of favor with the mainstream are allowed to speak their minds without fear of reprisal.
Exactly. They believe that a truly free society is one where all voices can be heard, even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
But of course, they recognize that there are limits to free speech.
Of course.
They acknowledge that speech that incites violence or poses a direct threat to public safety can be restricted.
Right. But they're very wary of expanding those limits because they believe that censorship is a slippery slope.
Right.
Once you start censoring one type of speech, it becomes easier to censor other types.
Right.
And eventually you end up with a society where only certain viewpoints are allowed.
So they're advocating for a very narrow definition of what constitutes harmful speech, focusing on speech that poses like a clear and present danger.
Exactly. They believe that erring on the side of free expression, even when it's uncomfortable or offensive, is ultimately the best way to protect a free society.
Okay, now let's talk about justice.
Right.
The book argues that justice should be blind. But what does that actually mean? Does it mean we should ignore the circumstances of a case and treat everyone exactly the same regardless of their background or the nature of their crime?
Not quite. Conservatives believe that justice should be impartial, meaning that it should be applied equally to all without prejudice or preference. But they also recognize that different situations require different responses.
Right.
It's about finding that balance between consistency and fairness.
So it's not about treating everyone exactly the same, but about ensuring that the law is applied fairly and consistently, taking into account the specific circumstances of each case.
Precisely. And that brings us to another question.
Okay.
Should justice be punitive or rehabilitative? The book argues that justice should be both.
Okay, so how do they reconcile those two things?
Well, they recognize that there needs to be a punitive element to deter future crimes and uphold the rule of law.
Okay.
But they also believe that rehabilitation is important.
Okay.
Especially when dealing with offenders who have the potential to turn their lives around.
Right.
They argue that a just society should seek to both punish wrongdoing and to help those who have gone astray find their way back to a productive and law-abiding life.
Now, here's a question that often sparks heated debate.
Okay.
Should justice be swift and efficient? Some argue that justice delayed is justice denied.
Right.
And that the courts should move quickly to resolve cases.
But conservatives are wary of sacrificing fairness for speed.
Okay.
They believe that due process is essential, even if it means that cases take longer to resolve.
Okay.
They argue that it's better to have a system that is slow and deliberate than one that is quick and prone to error.
Okay.
They prioritize getting it right over getting it done quickly.
Now, for a topic that's both deeply personal and intensely political, the death penalty, this is an issue that often divides people, even within the conservative movement.
It does.
So what does the book have to say about this?
Well, the book presents the conservative case for the death penalty,
Okay.
arguing that it's a just punishment for certain crimes,
Okay.
particularly those that involve the taking of innocent life.
Right. They cite the need to uphold the sanctity of life and to ensure that justice is served.
Exactly.
Okay.
But they also acknowledge that the death penalty is a complex issue with legitimate arguments against it.
Right.
They recognize the possibility of error and that the state should only use the death penalty in the most extreme cases.
Okay, let's shift gears and delve into, the economics of conservatism.
Okay.
Starting with, the free market.
Right.
Now, I know that conservatives are generally seen as being big proponents of the free market.
Yes.
But can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Conservatives see the free market as the best way to create wealth, to foster innovation, and to promote individual liberty. They see the market as this complex system that emerges from the countless interactions of individuals pursuing their own interests.
Right.
And they argue that the government should interfere in the market as little as possible.
So they're big believers in, the invisible hand of the market.
Exactly.
The idea that, the self-interested actions of individuals, guided by the price signals of the market, will lead to the best outcomes for society as a whole.
Precisely. They argue that government attempts to control the market, even with the best of intentions, often lead to unintended consequences. Distorting prices, creating shortages, and stifling innovation.
But they're not completely opposed to government intervention, are they?
No, they're not advocating for a completely laissez-faire approach. They recognize that there's a role for government in providing a basic framework for the market to operate in. Things like enforcing contracts, protecting property rights, and preventing fraud. But they believe that any government intervention in the market should be limited and carefully targeted.
So it's about finding that balance between the freedom of the market and the need for some level of regulation.
Precisely. They're not against all regulation, but they believe that regulation should be minimal and focused on creating a level playing field and protecting consumers from harm, not on trying to micromanage the economy.
Now, here's a question that often comes up in debates about capitalism.
Okay.
Is economic freedom essential for progress?
Conservatives would say absolutely. They believe that economic freedom is the engine of progress, the key to innovation and prosperity. They argue that when individuals are free to pursue their own economic interests, they're more likely to come up with new ideas, to take risks, and to create new products and services that benefit everyone.
And they point to the history of capitalism as evidence of this, right?
Exactly.
Arguing that capitalist societies have been the most innovative and prosperous societies in human history.
Right, and they attribute that success to the fact that capitalism allows individuals to be free to pursue their own economic interests. To experiment, to take risks, and to reap the rewards of their efforts.
But of course there are criticisms of capitalism.
Of course.
Some people argue that it leads to inequality and exploitation.
And conservatives don't deny that capitalism can have negative consequences.
Right.
They acknowledge that there will always be winners and losers in a free market. But they argue that the benefits of capitalism in terms of wealth, creation, innovation, and overall improvement in living standards far outweigh the costs.
So they believe that, like, the solution isn't to abandon capitalism altogether, but to try to find ways to mitigate those negative consequences while still preserving, like, the essential features of a free market.
They believe that the best way to address the negative consequences of capitalism is not to abandon the system altogether, but to create a framework that mitigates those consequences while preserving the essential features of a free market.
Now let's talk about individual freedom more broadly. Is it like the most important value?
Conservatives would say that it's incredibly important, but that it's not the only value. They recognize that individual freedom must be balanced with other values. Like responsibility, order, and community. They argue that a healthy society requires this balance between individual freedom and the common good.
So it's not about, like, unlimited freedom to do whatever you want, but about recognizing that your freedom is always going to be constrained by the rights of others. And by the need for, like, a stable and orderly society.
Precisely. They believe that true freedom flourishes within a framework of order. And that a society that allows individuals to do whatever they want without any regard for the consequences of their actions will quickly descend into chaos.
Now here's a question that's sure to spark debate. Does individual freedom have limits?
Conservatives would say absolutely. They believe that the idea of absolute freedom is a dangerous fantasy.
They recognize that individual freedom must be limited by the rights of others, by the need for order, and by the requirements of, like, a functioning society.
Exactly. They argue that without some limits on individual freedom, you would have anarchy.
And they point to the fact that even in the most free societies, there are always limits on individual freedom.
Of course.
You can't just go around doing whatever you want whenever you want.
Your freedom is always going to be constrained by the rights of others. And by the need to maintain a peaceful and orderly society.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, right?
Exactly.
That balance between individual freedom and the constraints necessary for a functioning society.
It's a delicate balancing act. But conservatives believe that it's essential for a free and prosperous society.
It really makes you think about, like, the bigger picture, doesn't it?
It does.
You know, we've been talking about economics and politics and culture, but it all seems to connect back to this core set of, like, values and principles.
And what's fascinating is how this conservative perspective, which is often portrayed as, like, being stuck in the past, actually offers a way of thinking about the challenges of the future.
That's a good point. It's not just about preserving the past. It's about using the wisdom of the past to navigate the complexities of the present. And to build a better future.
And that's where it gets really interesting. Because a lot of the issues that we're grappling with today, things like globalization, technological change, the erosion of traditional values, these are issues that conservatives have been thinking about and warning about for decades.
So maybe they have some insights that are worth considering, even if you don't agree with everything they say.
Precisely. It's about being open to different perspectives, challenging your own assumptions, and engaging in thoughtful debate. And that's something that I think the conservative perspective, with its emphasis on prudence and skepticism and this deep respect for the complexity of human affairs, can really contribute to.
It's been really eye-opening to explore these ideas in depth. I feel like I have a better understanding of where conservatives are coming from, even if I don't always agree with their conclusions.
And that's what's so valuable about engaging with different perspectives, It challenges us to think more critically about our own beliefs and to consider alternative ways of understanding the world.
So what does this all mean for our listener? How can they apply these conservative principles to their own lives?
That's a great question, and it's something that each individual has to grapple with for themselves.
But
I think the conservative perspective offers some valuable insights that can be applied to all aspects of life.
Like what, for example?
Well, for starters, there's that emphasis on personal responsibility. It's about taking ownership of your life, making choices that align with your values, and contributing to your community. It's about understanding that you have agency, that you're not just a passive recipient of whatever life throws at you.
That resonates with me. It's about being proactive, right?
Exactly.
Taking control of your own destiny and not waiting for someone else to solve your problem.
Exactly. And that ties into another key principle. The importance of hard work.
Conservatives
Conservatives believe that hard work is essential for individual success and for the well-being of society as a whole.
Right.
It's about applying yourself, developing your skills, and contributing to the world in a meaningful way.
So it's not just about working hard for your own benefit, but also about contributing to something larger than yourself.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important aspect of the conservative perspective, the emphasis on community. They believe that strong communities are essential for human flourishing.
Right.
It's about being connected to something larger than yourself, about forming bonds with your neighbors and working together to solve common problems.
So it's about recognizing that we're not just isolated individuals, but part of a larger social fabric, a web of relationships and responsibilities that give our lives meaning and purpose.
You got it. And that sense of community, that feeling of belonging and shared purpose is something that's increasingly rare in our individualistic and atomized society.
It makes you realize how important it is to cultivate those connections, to invest in our communities, and to support those institutions that bring people together and foster a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. And finally, I think the conservative perspective offers a valuable reminder of the importance of humility. It's about recognizing the limitations of human reason, the complexity of the world, and the unintended consequences of our actions.
Yeah, it's about approaching change with caution, respecting the wisdom of the past.
Exactly.
And being mindful of the fact that we don't always have all the answers.
It's about being open to learning from others, from history, and from our own mistakes.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of conservative thought. But we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And hopefully we've given our listener a lot to think about and to explore further. Remember, engaging with different perspectives, even ones you might not agree with, is essential for intellectual growth and for a healthy and vibrant public discourse.
So as you go about your day, as you interact with others, as you make decisions big and small, maybe think back to this conversation and consider the conservative perspective.
Ask yourself, how can I live in a way that honors the past while also building a better future? That's the challenge and the opportunity that lies before us all.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope it's given you a new perspective on conservative thought and perhaps even challenged some of your own assumptions.
I hope so.
We encourage you to explore the source material for yourself. There's so much wisdom and insight to be found there.
Absolutely.
And until next time, keep diving deep.